Hello Year 7s. As promised, I'm going to be reading to you the rest of the chapters of the book, starting with chapter 12, which is called The Counterfeit Church. Now before we do that, I thought you guys might want to see some of the pictures that are in my book that are not in your book. So the first page here we've got is a picture of Brother Andrew's home in Witter. And then at the bottom there, we got a picture of Brother Andrew when he was in the army. That's him with his two army friends. He's the one in the middle. Okay. Then we've got, at the top there, we've got a picture of Brother Andrew recovering in the middle at military hospital. He's the one on the far right there. Okay, you can see him right there. Yep. And then at the bottom here, we've got a picture of government offices in Warsaw, which is the very first communist country that he visits. Okay, and then we have also in Warsaw is some pictures of women going to market. They're carrying some really big sacks on their backs, possibly carrying some produce that they're wanting to go to sell. And at the bottom here, we've got a boy riding ahead of a car towards the refugee camps, to let them know that the Dutch people who'd come to help them had arrived. Okay. Here we've got Brother Andrew waiting to speak in a church in Eastern Europe. He's that young, fresh-faced fellow right there. Okay, and he's sitting there in a church behind the Iron Curtain, waiting to speak to the crowd. Then at the bottom here, we've got Brother Andrew in Hungary, which is where he met Professor B and his son right before he was going to propose to Corrie. And here he is with some of those believers in the early 1960s. Here we've got Brother Andrew with a lady called Corrie ten Boom. Some of you might have heard of her, some of you might not have. She is a very well-known, quite famous Holocaust survivor. So she survived a concentration camp, and you can find many videos of her online telling her own story. Then at the bottom here, we've got Andrew at the Great Wall of China in 1965, just before the Great Cultural Revolution. Okay. Then we've got a couple more. Here is just a few of the Bibles in Andrew's collection. He's been traveling to many different countries for many different years, so he's got Bibles in just about every language available. Then at the bottom here, we've got a picture of a big boat that they had filled with millions of Bibles. It was called Project Pearl, and this was a secret mission that they had to try and smuggle millions of Bibles at a time into China from this boat. It's quite an interesting story. I'll tell you guys about it sometime. And then here we've got Brother Andrew meeting someone important in front of a place called Bethlehem College. And then here we've got Andrew meeting with one of the leaders of I'm pretty sure a Muslim group in Gaza. So here Andrew is showing that even though they believe very different things, he is still called to go and bring the love of God and show them what it looks like to be a Christian. And this is this one as well. This is a very important one. And we're going to find out a little bit about this picture when we get to the Q&A section at the back of the book. He's meeting someone called the Ayatollah. And it's a very important person leading a interesting Muslim group. Let's put it that way. And you guys will get to find out a bit more about what was happening in this picture when we read the Q&A section at the back of the book. And then here we've got Andrew speaking at the National Open Doors Day in the Netherlands. So this is obviously a day where they gather funds and they encourage people to do whatever they can to support the persecuted church that are still in many countries around the world today. It's not the same countries as they would have been in Brother Andrew's time, although some of them are still the same. But there are still many, many countries where it's really hard to be a Christian, especially in places like North Korea, Afghanistan, and many, many others. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to start reading chapter 12, The Counterfeit Church. So where we left off, Andrew and Corey had just gotten engaged, officially, and he just found out that his friend Professor B in Hungary had lost his job because he lost his job because he helped Andrew. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to read chapter 12, and we're going to see what happens next. Corey and I were married in Alkmaar on June 27th, 1958. Grieke was there, and Mr. Ringers, and many others from the factory, as well as a whole busload of nurses from Haarlem. Uncle Hoppy came from London with greetings from his wife, who was not strong enough for the trip. There were friends from the WEC headquarters, co-workers from the refugee camps, and of course Corey's mother and my brothers and sisters and their families. For me, there were missing faces: Antonin, the medical student in Czechoslovakia, Jamil and Nicola in Yugoslavia, Janos and Professor B. Obviously, these guys couldn't make it because they were still stuck in their own countries because of their oppressive governments. It was dark before we could tear ourselves away from so many friends and recollections. For the honeymoon, we had borrowed Karl de Graaf's house trailer. We had talked romantically about driving to France, but setting out, we realized suddenly how tired we were. Corey from her final examinations, just ended. I from the work in the refugee camps, where I had spent most of my time since our engagement. A few miles from Alkmaar, we came to a restaurant in that rarity in Holland. A few miles from Alkmaar, we came to a restaurant in that rarity in Holland had a grove of trees. We parked beneath them and went in for a coffee. And so cordial were the owner and his wife, and so insistent that the trailer was no trouble, that's as far as we got. We pulled the trailer a little deeper under the trees and spent our honeymoon right there. I think you guys can use your imagination there. Not too much though. The dark and dank little room above the shed wasn't dark or dank at all. How could I ever have thought so? With Corey, sunshine and warmth came into the place and made it home. So we didn't have a kitchen. So there was no plumbing in our home. So the roof did leak a bit here and there, and never 2 nights in the same place. What did it matter, as long as we were together? The only problem of any size was the clothing bundles. I had talked in churches all over Holland about the need for clothes in the refugee camps, and suggested my address as a place things might be sent. I never dreamed how much would come. It came by mail, by train, by truck, load after load, deposited in the tiny front yard in Witte. 8 tons were delivered that first year, and the problem of storage was acute, so very bad. Markie was married now and living with her husband's family, but Adi and Helke had a second child, and Cornelius and his new wife were living in the loft. There was no place for the clothes but our own room. Corey and I literally had to scramble over bales of clothing each time we went in or out our door. That's pretty crazy, right? The worst of it was that so much of it came unwashed. We would scrub the dirtiest things in the tub in the backyard and brush and spray the rest. But our room was never without fleas. Transporting such a quantity of stuff was another problem. I packed the car as full as I could each time I left for the camps. But for all its advantages, the Volkswagen made an unsatisfactory truck. I was eager to go again, this time with Corrie at my side. I wanted her to see the camps for herself, not only so that she could meet these people for whom she was washing and packing so constantly, but because I knew what a nurse could mean in places like those. And so, that fall, we piled the back seat to the roof with sweaters and coats and shoes and set out for the camps in West Berlin. We delivered the first load to Fischer Bunker. This was an old circular military barracks used by the Nazis during the war and now converted into homes for refugees. It was Corrie's first glimpse of the squalor in the camps, and that night she could not eat. I purposely saved the Volksmatras camp for the second day because it was even worse. This old factory building must have held 5,000 people. Conditions were so desperate that a girl would sell her body for 50 pfennig, about 15 cents. As we carried our bundles of clothing to the distribution center, a group of youngsters leaned out of a window and dumped garbage over us. "Don't be angry at them," I said to Corrie as I brushed rotting lettuce leaves off her coat. "They have literally nothing to do here but think up mischief." But to me, the saddest of all the camps was Henry Dunant. Corrie and I went there last. This camp, named after the founder of the Red Cross, was where so many professionals, especially teachers, were sent. The camp made me sad not because it was physically any worse than the rest, but because the people in it tried harder to retain their traditions, and this has made the inevitable failures more poignant, so more obvious. I came out of the director's office that afternoon to find Corrie talking with a grey-haired East German lady who said her name was Henrietta. There was something in her manner that reminded me of Miss Meikle. We found a relatively uncrowded corner and sat talking for an hour. Henrietta told us that she had been a teacher of 13 and 14-year-olds in Saxony, and that this was where the trouble lay. If I had been teaching 6 or 7-year-olds, I might have been able to close my eyes, she said. But no, I had them right at the time of the Jugendwehr. The Jugendwehr? Yes, you see, said Henrietta. I'm a Lutheran, which is a denomination of Christianity. In our church, confirmation is a very big thing in a child's life, perhaps the biggest single day. There are gifts and speeches and congratulations and new privileges, like long pants for the boys. It's a religious day above all. Vows are taken, promises are made. And then Henrietta told us about the Jugendwehr, the youth consecration. I could see right away that it was an extremely clever attack against the church. The government substituted a ceremony of its own for the Christian confirmation. In the Jugendwehr, it is the state rather than God to whom vows are made, said Henrietta. And the state makes a very big thing of the solemnity and binding quality of these promises. That's pretty crazy, right? They're making vows to the state instead of God. Teachers are expected to spend a year preparing students to take part in it. I could see what had happened before Henrietta spoke. And you refused, I said. I refused. That was a brave thing to do. Henrietta laughed. "No," she said. "I certainly am not brave. I was just a school teacher about to retire. I'm not a martyr. But I just could not bring myself to teach these wonderful young people that the state was God." It was expected that 100% of eligible students take part in the counterfeit ritual. From Henrietta's class, there were 30%. So counterfeit is like a fake, not quite as good substitute of the real thing. So the real thing in this case would be the confirmation ceremony of the church. And the state had created a counterfeit to distract the young people and to lead them away from the church. Like we saw, using this strategy, like we saw some of the other countries that we've talked about so far, using different strategies. But this is the strategy that they used here. At first, she said, the pressure on her to conform was low-keyed. Party officials took to paying her friendly visits about once a week. Naturally, it was expected that the teacher do his best to bring all of his students to the Jugendweihe. Next year, there were certain things would be different. Well, next year, things weren't different. And then I was really pressured, Henrietta said. The weekly visits became nightly visits. Different people each night for a week after week. Round and round we went over the same old subject. Where was my loyalty? Did I realize I could be accused of holding back progress? That was a serious crime in the People's Republic. Night after night, they stayed in the apartment until late, stirring her up, frightening her until she could not sleep. Henrietta's temper grew short. Her work suffered. And in the meantime, pressure was being put on the children too. So that they began to ask why they weren't ready for the Jugendweihe, as everyone else was. And so you see, said Henrietta, and she was crying now, I fled. I couldn't take it. I ran away. And that, she said, sweeping her arm to include the whole camp filled with teachers who, like her, had fled, is why you must not think of me as brave. Maybe we started out to be brave, but we gave up. Every one of us. Talking with Henrietta and other refugees, I was gradually forming a picture of the church as a whole, as it existed under communism. In my mind, I began to think of an outer periphery, countries where, according to my own experiences and the reports of others, there was still some degree of religious freedom. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and East Germany. Beyond these, according to those who had escaped, was an inner circle, where the attack against the church was strong indeed. Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and Russia itself. I had visited all but one of the outer periphery countries. Now I knew I had to visit East Germany, which is where Henrietta was from. Here in West Berlin was the obvious point of departure for such a visit. But when I proposed the trip to Corrie, she looked at me with stricken eyes. "Oh, Andy," she said, "how can I leave the camps? There's so much to do and no one to do it. How can I go?" I looked at her more closely. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes had an unnatural glaze. I wondered if I had not been wrong to plunge her into such need and deprivation. It was hard enough for me to see the suffering, but for a nurse, trained to see what should be done, but without facilities to do it, it must be torture indeed. She was moving from camp to camp like a woman beside herself, setting up a class for mothers here, a tank for boiled water there, at one place simply trying to get the dishes of those who did not have tuberculosis, handled separately from the dishes of those who did. In the afternoons, she held an impromptu clinic wherever she was, painting feverish throats, cleaning old sores, washing infected eyes, even on occasion pulling teeth. For her own sake, I began to want to get her away from this environment, but she refused. "You go," she said, when the visas for East Germany came through without delay. "What good would I be there? I can't preach, I can't speak German, I can't even drive a car, but I can spot a toilet crawling with germs when I see one." She picked up the kit of disinfectant that was never far from her side in those days. "Tell me about it when you get back," she said. And so occurred the first separation in our married life, not because of my ministry, but Corey's. Just gonna take a quick pause there, guys. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, just to go grab a quick drink. I crossed over from West to East Berlin at a checkpoint near the Brandenburg Tor. The difference between the two halves of the city was observable even as I drove down the streets. I had been prepared for the slightly shabby clothes, for the shops in which large vases of flowers filled the space where suits should hang, for the lag in reconstruction after the war. What I was not prepared for was the silence. Nobody talked in the streets. There was an eerie quality about it, as if the land were in mourning or in fear. As time passed, I came to feel this fear myself. There were police everywhere. They stood at the bridges, at factory entrances, at public buildings, stopping people at random, searching briefcases, shopping bags, pocketbooks. And no one complained about this arbitrary treatment. No one protested. The lack of protest was part of the dreadful silence that hung over the city like a poison-filled smog. In sharp contrast to the silence of the people was the loud voice of the government. It was everywhere. On the radio, on loudspeakers, on billboards. Slogans were painted on walls, rooftops, telephone poles. There were posters in the kiosks, in stores, hotels, railway stations. Propaganda everywhere. I was astonished at the boldness of the line. East Germany was just then going through a devastating food shortage. The enterprising German farmer had not taken at all kindly to the collective idea. So they tried to get everyone to do collective farming. Obviously, what they're saying here, some people didn't like that. He had quit the land in such large numbers that fall there had been no one to harvest the crops. The government had pressed production on mechanical harvesters, accompanied by a massive propaganda campaign. There was going to be plenty of bread because socialism was superior to the enterprise of individual farmers. That's what they're saying. There was only one trouble. To be harvested by machine, the wheat had to be dry. A couple of days more sunshine were required than for hand reaping. And of course, that year it rained. It rained every day, right at the time of the harvest. And then suddenly, all over the country, posters appeared carrying this little verse. On God on Sonnenschein holen wir die Ernte ein. Without God and without sun, we will get the harvest done. That is pretty in your face, guys. They're literally taking on God himself. They're being idiots, basically. I could see that the slogan had really shaken people. It was a brazen duel between the new regime and God himself. The rains continued, and the harvest did not get in. Overnight, as suddenly as they had appeared, the posters vanished, all except for the sodden few that you could still see clinging to lampposts. And now what did the government do? New signs appeared, along with announcements on the radio and advertisements in the newspaper. Don't let anyone tell you that there is a bread shortage. There is plenty of bread. This is another example of the victory of socialism over the forces of nature. Only there was no bread. I myself went into grocery stores and found none. Even restaurants didn't have any. The saddest part of the story to me is that no one talked about the duplicity. So the obvious fact that, there is no bread, but they keep saying there is bread. They're basically lying to people, trying to keep them silent, while at the same time insisting, of course there's bread, but there is no bread. And bread at in a country this poor would have been the main food source. So no bread is as a result of no wheat, no flour. So that would also mean no pasta or anything that is made from bread, or anything that is made from flour. So, and that includes quite a lot of very sustaining products. So, yeah, no bread is very bad. And because they had trouble with the farming, they also would have had a lack of fresh vegetables and other produce that they needed. The saddest part of the story to me is that no one talked about the duplicity, so people were too scared to say anything about it. The missing bread was never mentioned. The people were silent. They were too terrified to say a thing. They just went along with it. We're going to leave it there for this part. I will continue reading the rest of the chapter to you guys later. So this is part 1 of chapter 12. See you guys.